Greetings, this is Preston Smith, editor of Thecorners magazine, that's www.thecorners.pl, coming to you with the three things. Now, the three things are the three things I'm going to want you to think about this week or to consider thinking about this week. We're going to get into depth on these three things, but before I tell you what they are, I also am happy to say that we are filming our inaugural show from a brand new studio, which I believe this is going to be called the MRP, Evgeniy, the MRP Studios. Yeah, Evgeniy, he's filming. Maybe that's it. I'll have to ask Craig Smith. This is also his endeavor, but I'm pretty happy. Pretty cool place. Now, let's get into the three things. What are we going to talk about today? Now, again, the first thing you can probably guess is going to be about the war in Ukraine and what is happening there. But we're going to talk about, are we getting into a new Somme situation? Like, are we getting to a situation where neither side can make any progress? Or are we actually going beyond that with cluster munitions, F-16s possibly coming maybe as early as the end of this year? Are we getting to a point that the war is going to a brand new phase? I'll give you a hint. Maybe, yes, we are. The second thing, well, this is also related to Ukraine, although I don't want to make this, just the war in Ukraine channel, because that's not what the Corners is. That's not what, but this week, what do you say? Belarus, Lukashenko, Putin meeting in Belarus, Lukashenko joking that the Wagners that are there, maybe there's 5,000, 6,000, they just can't wait to invade Poland, ostensibly through the Suwalki Gap. What does that mean? Should we worry about it? What are the long-term connotations? Again, are we now going to a brand new phase in the war? And finally, the third thing is actually we're going to go down to the Balkans and briefly talk about, you guessed it, Kosovo and Serbia. There's a reason for that, but you're going to have to wait and see. The first thing, obviously we're going to talk about the war in Ukraine, but specifically, have we reached a point, which is basically the equivalent of the Somme in World War I? I'm just using the Somme. There were many battles, but we're talking about the trench warfare. Neither side could gain the upper hand. Neither side could get a breakthrough and do anything that looked as if it were going to change the course of the war. Now, of course, if you have read about World War I, you follow the history, it's easy to now, we're talking 100 years ago, look back and say, oh, well, yeah, but then tanks, the Americans came through, et cetera, et cetera. But if you remember, if you read anything, and I don't mean just history books, but the writings of the writers that came out of that time, things were bleak beyond imagination in the sense that there was the feeling this war is never going to end. No one could see an advantage. No one could see an advantage. Now, as we know, technology moved forward, but the argument and the worry could be right now that we've kind of hit the same stage. As bizarrely as it sounds, no one expected that we could wind up with basically a static trench warfare type of war between two powers with modern weapons, and both powers now have modern weapons. But why? Well, because of drones. Because of drones and the fact that they can identify what the other side is doing in real time. However, before we get into that and what this really means, and also we'll talk about mines, we'll talk about cluster munitions, and are we getting to a point where, despite this stalemate, that it's going to get into complete escalation? Yes, I'm talking about F-16s. I want to read a couple of messages that were passed to me just over the past couple of days, the last few days, from people that read the Corners. I'm not going to use their names. It's difficult to do that if you don't go and talk to their friends, the people, the victims of the tragedies. But from LP, this is he related to me or forwarded me a message from a team leader of a group of people doing great things in Odessa. Obviously, Odessa has been hit hard over the last few days by Russian missile strikes. Please pray for our safety and that of our team. Third night of explosions here in Odessa. So this was a couple of days ago. In the past hour, I have heard at least 10 explosions, of which 2 sounded like missiles hitting targets close to our home. As I lie here in bed, I can hear air defense's big guns battling to shoot down kamikaze drones before they reach their targets. Scary stuff, makes you think. Another one, Patrick P. Now, Patrick P., I'm going to get him on the show. one of these days, or at least we're going to highlight him in the magazine or on the website, which, by the way, if I haven't said, www.thecorners.pl. Patrick P. He's a guy from Texas. I'm originally from Texas. He's a photographer out there. He's been spending a lot of time in Ukraine. I just asked him, "How you doing? You know, how are you dealing with this?" His answer was, "Look, he's dealing with a guy who he said he lost his entire family of 7, along with 41 others in missile strikes." This poor man, he walks 12 kilometers daily back to the site where the strikes happened to sit and just ponder what happened to him and these poor people. You know, this kind of thing really makes you think. I have to admit, I've heard artillery from a distance quite a long time ago, but I've never been under strikes, near strikes, been worried that strikes could happen to me. This is something that is difficult, honestly, for me to fathom. And the Ukrainians are dealing with this. They've dealt with this day in, day out. And what else can you call it? It's evil. It's evil. Now, let's get to the actual subject at hand, the first thing, and what all this really means. Now, I was thinking about going through some of the different battles and the war developments, but you know, we're going to save that. I put that out once a week, or I've started to put that out once a week, midweek for Patreon users, where I'll go into detail. But there's hard fighting in different parts of the front, as you probably know. In Zaporizhia, there's not a lot that's been gained, but there may be some progress with the Ukrainians pushing towards Robotnia. They're pushing hard for Staromayorsk and Donetsk. Really tough fighting in Klishchiva, Bakhmut, as you know. I'll get into all that. I will just say that it's not all one side. The Russians are also pushing. This week, we're going to keep an eye on what is going on, especially up in Kupiansk. There was a lot of talk. There was a lot of press about the buildup of 100,000 Russian troops. That was a little bit probably exaggerated, but the push is coming. Now, what I will say is that when you follow the news, and what I try to do is get in touch with people that are actually out there that I know can give me an idea of what's happening, but you also got to follow what's going on the blogs, the Russian blogs, the Ukrainian blogs, the kind of geolocation YouTube sites. When you see one side talking mostly about hitting ammo dumps, or another side talking about shooting down, say, Ukrainian helicopters or Ukrainian planes, you know, you kind of can read into that. There's not a lot of progress happening on the ground, and you're kind of seeing that from both sides. But let's talk about this situation, about this offensive stalemate, and what does it mean for the Ukrainian counteroffensive? Now, this is relevant. One reason why it's relevant is because today, actually, Putin and Lukashenko, they met in Belarus and they brought up the offensive. They were just two guys sitting around having a chat, as they like to do and sort of pose for the press. And they talked about the offensive, and Lukashenko said, there is no offensive. Putin said, well, there is, but it's completely failed. Okay. Let's hold back. Now on the U.S. side or the U.K. side, at the same time, whether you're talking about Sky News or the BBC or various news reports, there are interviews with analysts and even generals saying, well, you know, it's going slower than we'd like, but we think we might see a breakthrough, and then the Ukrainians can pour in and make the kind of progress that we saw, you know, way back when the Kherson offensive saw such success. Okay, well, you kind of have to take, in my opinion, take both sides with a bit of a grain of salt. What we are seeing now, I don't believe this is even really the offensive, the real offensive. What I do think is that it is an offensive, but that the Ukrainians have been holding back. Now, this is not to downplay the fighting that I was talking about in some of these different locations, but if you take a look at what's actually happening along the front, there's a few things of note. One, suddenly the cluster munitions are there. Now, this is a good point to focus on. First of all, kind of a surprise, because cluster munitions seem to have popped up all along the front, and they're being used by the Ukrainians, which is pretty quick, considering that we just kind of saw the news that the U.S. said, yes, they're going to send cluster munitions, and suddenly we're seeing them all along the front. Now, we can't underestimate how quickly the U.S. can get how effective U.S. logistics can be when they need to be, and we're talking about artillery shells, yeah, they can move those pretty fast, but it is a bit of a surprise, and it may have caught the Russians by surprise in the sense that everyone knows there are large stockpiles of Russian cluster munitions, but they've been used, but not on scale, and they're not yet being used on scale. Although, of course, the Russian bloggers saying, "Oh, you wait, we're going to show you we're going to show you, how much we can do with cluster munitions." And there may be a little bit of truth to that, but when we're seeing this along the front, there is a different aspect of the cluster munition argument. And that has been, and it's come up in various publications, that can cluster munitions, one, how effective are they going to be? Two, why have they been banned? But three, can they be used to clear a path through minefields? So let's go through that. Now, actually, this is a really important point, which kind of may give us a window into whether or not we're going to see this Ukrainian counteroffensive gain steam. So very quickly, point by point. Not much to tell you new why cluster munitions are banned. They're banned because they don't always go off. There's a lot of duds, and then they lie around everywhere, and innocent civilians, they trip on them, animals blow them up, even soldiers from the advancing side, they hit their own cluster munitions, guys get maimed, etc., or injured. Now, the U.S. has come out, first they came out and said that they had a very low dud rate, 1 to 2%. That's what I heard. Then the dud rate was supposedly 3%. Then I saw today that it's supposed to be 2.35%. Now, I was very curious about this, and I was very curious about whether or not cluster munitions could be used to clear a path through minefields. Because if you're talking about, for example, Zaporizhzhia, along that front where the minefields are like 5 kilometers deep, and then you've got an anti-tank trench, and then you've got these anti-tank obstacles, these dragon's teeth, and then you've got maybe the real trench, and then behind that you've got artillery. That's a pretty tough barrier to get through. And up until now, we've seen that Ukrainians have had a lot of difficulties because of these minefields. This is one of the things that's been slowing down the counteroffensive. No. So I talked to a couple of guys that have military experience. They kind of thought of cluster munitions from the side of being used on them. And obviously, they're like, yeah, those can be very effective, and we wouldn't want to experience that. As far as clearing a path through a minefield, they're like, I don't know. I hadn't given that much thought to it. So I did a little bit more research, and I came upon a very interesting article that was in NPR. I'm going to put this link down for you. And the article was an interview with a U.S. Army Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, and he talked about sending cluster munitions to the Ukrainians. Now, one of the things he noted was that he was actually in Iraq, and he was hit by 5, if I remember correctly. Is that correct? I believe, yeah. Desert Storm, accidentally hit with 5 rounds of cluster munitions. And he described it as being inside a popcorn popper, and 31 soldiers immediately had casualties. Now he wrote, or the interviewer wrote, that he said that 29 of these guys returned to duty. They had shrapnel wounds. 2 of them did not. They had more serious cases. They had to be medevac to a hospital. But he said the biggest problem, again, is that they don't always go off. Now, the interview asked, why don't they go off? Well, he described them, and you'll see in the photo that I'll put up here or there, I don't remember. You'll see in the photo that they're like tin cans, right? That's a photo of a Russian cluster munition, but still they're kind of similar. So these tin cans, that they hit the ground, if they hit the rounded edge, maybe they don't go off, or maybe they hit soft ground, they don't go off. And when they asked him about the dud rate, he said, look, in the past that dud rate was between 5 and 10%. And he said this estimate from the U.S. Department of Defense, 1 to 2%, pretty conservative. So that means there's going to be a risk that if you use them to actually clear a minefield, your own guys might step on them. Then they asked him, are they going to be effective for clearing a minefield? He didn't seem too positive. And I couldn't find anyone that I know, and I know a few people with military experience, that seemed overly optimistic with that either. So I'm not sure that's going to work, which leads us to how are the Ukrainians going to get through these minefields? Now, I don't want to sound defeatist yet, so give me a chance here. Well, you've got mine-clearing vehicles. The Ukrainians don't seem to have too many of them. You've got kind of mine plows where these go forward and they push the mines to the side. You've got basically it's a technology where it's like they lay a string of explosives that create a path through the mines, but this isn't going to be very deep or very wide. The problem with all of these is that when you try to create this path, one, the vehicles can be hit, two, you're funneling your troops and people and your armor through a narrow lane, then it's going to come to an edge where there's still a mine, maybe the troop carrier, the Bradley, or a tank hits a mine, gets stopped, there's a concentration of artillery fire, and then the guys that are trying to move forward there, they got a problem. Okay, they got a problem. Now, if we wanted to take a step back and talk about the Ukrainian counteroffensive, what we have seen for the most part, obviously this depends on what are you describing. Are you describing south of Bakhmut, or are you describing some of the small gains, say in Zaporizhia? But a lot of what you're seeing, what we keep seeing, are these kind of forays. Might be 10 guys, 20 guys, might be 50 guys, a few Bradleys, maybe a tank or two. They go in, they try, maybe they take a little ground, it doesn't work, they pull back out. This, to me, does not look like the actual Ukrainian counteroffensive. It is a counteroffensive, but it's definitely not the full whack, hey, we're going to try to push for a breakthrough. What were we probably going to see when that happens? Well, and I don't think I'm giving away any secrets here, and I'm not I didn't talk to somebody to try to find this out, so please nobody get paranoid about this. But what you're probably going to see, well, you're going to need to control the air. You're going to need to jam drone devices because you can't let people see what's going on. You're probably going to need to put up smoke screen. You're going to need a concentration of these vehicles. You're going to need to focus on some part of the front if you're going to try to get through these layers, maybe 5 kilometers of mines to that first ditch, et cetera, et cetera. I think when the real counteroffensive starts, it's going to be really quite obvious, unless the Ukrainians have something up their sleeve, and I wouldn't exactly put it past them. But if we take one more step back and we say, okay, air dominance, we need air dominance. Now we're talking the F-16s, okay? Now we already have cluster munitions there. Now we're talking F-16s. There's two questions. One, when will the F-16s get here? Well, the Biden administration seem to be implying that they're going to be in Ukraine and I guess used by the end of the year. Just a week or so ago, the Ukraine Ministry of Defense said they think maybe March of next year. This is pretty indicative that everyone is actually fairly soberly looking at this for the long haul. What I really don't think right now is that Zelensky and the Ukrainians have actually been insane, and are some of the stats that you're seeing that they've already used up 20%, 30% of the U.S. supplied Bradleys and armored vehicles. I think maybe that's actually wrong. That could be 20% or higher of the Bradleys that actually have gone into combat, but I don't think it's 20 or 30% of the total, just based on the forays of what we've been seeing, and the fact that it's clear that they're holding back troops that are their most hardcore troops for a real offensive. But what does this also mean? Well, cluster munitions, F-16s, yes, it's very possible we're getting to a new point in the war, a new escalation between not just Ukraine and Russia, but between the East and the West, which is going to bring us to the second thing, which is Belarus. Now, the second thing, Belarus. Now, Belarus is important, especially for me. I'm sitting here in Poland, and a lot of the people that read the corners are in Poland, and we hear talk of the Suwalki Gap that I mentioned in the first segment of the program, and how Lukashenko is talking about, these Wagners, they want to invade. This kind of thing means that the the subject of Belarus is important. But before we get into that, I'm going to tell you a little story, kind of an aside that goes way back to the 90s. I was actually working, at the time I was working for a Czech company. I had to go up to Petersburg, to St. Petersburg, and I was in Russia. It was the first time in Russia. It was really actually pretty cold. And I had an interpreter, because not that I speak good Russian now, but I certainly didn't speak good Russian then. And he was a Belgian guy that actually spoke Russian. He said, look, we're going to go kind of through a kind of a section, a neighborhood that's like an open air market, which was, it was freaking cold, but it was still an open air market. He said, if you see something happen, I want you to be careful and not fall for it. I said, well, what? He said, well, if suddenly you see a wallet falls on the ground right next to your feet, just ignore it. Don't pick it up. It's not yours. Forget it. If someone tries to pick your pocket, don't make a big fuss of it. Don't point fingers or anything. I said, well, what are you getting at? And he said, well, here's the thing. In this kind of low-level gangster culture that, like in an open-air market, you might encounter throughout Central Europe. I don't want to just pick on Russia on this point. He said a standard tactic is to accuse you of something that someone else is doing. So, for example, you pick up the wallet that fell on the ground because you're just being a nice guy, and you say, hey, somebody dropped their wallet. They'll say, hey, you stole my wallet. And then you get grabbed, they take your wallet, it becomes a big mess, and you get your own money stolen, and you might even get in trouble or beat up or something. Another thing that happens if somebody tries to pick your pocket, and you say, hey, you picked my pocket. They'll say, no, you picked my pocket, and the whole thing gets turned around on you. This is kind of a standard kind of strategy or ploy, whatever you want to call it, that you get when you get into this kind of gangster culture that unfortunately applies to the government of Russia right now, and you could say to the government of Belarus too. And he said, don't fall for that. Now, so I want you to keep this in mind now that we're going to talk about Belarus. And why am I bringing this up? Because, as I mentioned, Lukashenko, Putin palling around in Belarus, and they said some things which were rather disturbing. One is they're, in a way, and this is a little worrying, they're kind of brimming with overconfidence in the sense that Lukashenko said, oh, you know, there is no offensive. Putin, he said, well, you know, there is, but it's completely failed. At the same time, Lukashenko said, well, you know, these Wagners, and we estimate, we think there's maybe 5,000 there. There have been several convoys that have come in. They've set up. Prigozhin, who's a little bit maybe irrelevant, set up something called the Concord Consulting Company, which sounds kind of British, to be honest. And he's talking about doing big things, etc. But Lukashenko is saying, I'm having a hard time controlling these Wagners because they want to invade Poland, hit the Suwalki Gap. Now, let me tell you, if they hit the Suwalki Gap, that right there, well, that is an escalation. We've got a big problem. And again, you kind of, you know, is it just a couple of blowhards talking about this type of thing? Well, there are a couple things that make me worry on this point. One, we get into this psychology that I just talked about. You know, we're going to accuse you of something that you actually haven't done. We turn it around on you, kind of this wag the dog on in a Russian fashion, or accuse you of something that, you know, you weren't even planning to do, but we're planning to do. So I still remember this story, and you think, oh, well, hey, Preston, maybe you're being a little paranoid there. Well, I'll tell you something else that I'm a little bit worried about, and this goes back to Kosovo. And you're thinking, well, Kosovo, you know, I kind of tell where I'm going because I'm going to be talking about Kosovo in the third thing. But yeah, Kosovo. The reason is this. Now, I'm not saying this is going to happen. I'm just saying I'm a little bit worried about it because the Wagner's trying to invade, hitting the Suwalki Gap, which some people say is the most dangerous, vulnerable point in Europe, you know, where the East and the West meets. But it's not like it's not on the radar. It's not like the U.S. isn't watching it. NATO's not watching it. Poland's not watching it. So that would be kind of suicidal to try to go for the Suwalki Gap. But they are talking about it, as are some Russian politicians. And here is the kind of the twinge of worry that kind of bugs me. It's keeping me awake at night. It does go back to Kosovo. This goes back to what I consider, to be honest, kind of a failed political strategy on the part of the U.S., although I don't think it was actually U.S. strategy. I blame it on Madeleine Albright. And you say, Madeleine Albright, where are you going? Well, we take a look at the war in Kosovo. We had the war in Yugoslavia. At the time, Richard Holbrooke came in, proved himself to be a master negotiator, grabbed Milosevic, put him under some F-16s and some advanced fighter planes, freaked him out, and worked out a deal to end the war in Yugoslavia. Of course, I'm simplifying this a bit. After the war in Yugoslavia is over, there's the war in Kosovo. The war in Kosovo at that time actually did not have, it wasn't anything like the war in Yugoslavia when you talk to the number of casualties. It was something literally, it was small. It was like a hillbilly war, 1,700 casualties, something like that. However, and these weren't all Albanians or Kosovo Albanians. These also were Serbs because the KLA was very active. Of course, the Serbs would come in, they would get very heavy-handed. But at the time, and I remember this going around through different journalists I knew and people that were watching this saying this was becoming kind of Madeleine Albright's fixation, Madeleine Albright's war. The U.S. intervened. You remember we bombed, we hit Belgrade, we actually hit the Chinese embassy. This whole thing happened, and then the Serbs went in. Hundreds of thousands of Kosovo Albanians had to flee. It became a huge mess, and it's still a huge mess to this day. But one thing that people don't think about is when that happened, bing, a light went off in Russia, because from the Russian point of view, Kosovo was part of a sovereign state of Serbia. They said, you're going to hit part of a sovereign state. That opened the door for them to hit Chechnya and said, don't you talk to us about Chechnya. Of course, the first time they went into Chechnya, they had a hard time, but then the second time they destroyed Chechnya, took it over. And that was one of these types of very kind of legalistic, twisted types of thinking that you do this, we do this. Or we're going to accuse you of doing something that you're not even doing yet, but then we're planning on doing. This kind of gangster, and you got to remember, this whole background of the Russian elite, the Russian government, it gets pretty gangsterish, even if you go back into the origins of Putin and some of his contacts in St. Petersburg, etc. But now, let's take this one step further. One step further. What have we also seen going on in Ukraine? Forget just the stalemate of the lines, the overall war, all the stuff that I mentioned that I'll go into detail during the update. We have seen raids, for example, across the border into Russia, Belgorod, by these Russian freedom fighters. Now, these Russian freedom fighters, well, let's not be naive here. Yeah, they're supported. I mean, they've got weapons. We might as well say it openly. They're clearly supported by Ukraine. That's what I think. I don't have proof of this. I'm not sitting there, but this is the type. Ukraine saying, "Hey, look, these are Russians. They're invading Russia because they want to get rid of Putin. This isn't us. We may enjoy watching this, but it's not us. The Russians have a different opinion." Now, flip this up. Let's go up to Belarus and think about the Suwalki Gap. It would be very easy using this type of logic now if the Wagner suddenly did raids into the Suwalki Gap, that the Russians say, well, actually, that's not us. Those are mercenaries. They're their own thing. They're doing their own thing. That's even a new company. Why did Prigozhin set up this Concord Consulting Company? Why is Prigozhin even alive? What is his use? Because he has to have some kind of use. Nobody can figure this out. That is one thing that's making me worry. Another thing, Russia could say, well, actually, this is some sort of Belarusian thing. You can always come up with some sort of excuses to kind of keep the democratic apparatus of NATO and the EU at bay. I don't think this is going to happen, but I'm worried about it. I am a little worried about it when they talk about this. I also have to say I'm a bit worried about this kind of bizarre overconfidence, looking at the way the offensive isn't working or saying it's not working, it's petering out. This does bring us also to some of the quiet things the Russians have been doing. It was very easy to say for quite some time. Oh, the Russians, they're done. They don't have any weapons left. They don't have any ammunition, et cetera, et cetera. However, that's not exactly true. There have been new attack helicopters that have showed up on the front. Maybe people didn't expect this. On the flip side, this Kupiansk issue that I was talking about, we're getting reports that, yeah, there is a push. This is not something to panic over yet, but the Ukrainians are going to have to react. The Russians, maybe they pushed in 5 kilometers, changed the front lines, kind of in the Svatovo Kupiansk. We're keeping an eye on that. Like I said, let's not panic over it yet. But a little worried about this, and it brings us up to one last point, which is a little bit of a roundabout point for the second thing, Belarus, and that is the Zelensky gamble. Let's talk about the Zelensky gamble in the sense of this counteroffensive, because there have been questions. Why even launch the counteroffensive when we were, no air superiority yet? The Allied weapons and the tanks and the armor coming really too slow, and giving the Russians time to build up this endless, this sea of mines, these barriers that we were talking about. And there's actually a Washington Post article, I'm not sure if I mentioned this in the first part, where they're talking about you need like 500 demining teams, 757 years, I don't know how they came up with that, to demine Ukraine. And it's like 60,000 square miles, or something that's like the size of Florida, that would need to be demined in Ukraine. This is seriously a problem, and you had to wonder why the counteroffensive. Why even announce it or plan it when everything was coming so slow? And that leads us also back to this NATO conference that took place in Lithuania, where during the conference, it was clear that Zelensky expected NATO to come out with a timeline that would say, yes, you're going to join NATO, and this is the process, this is the timeline. This did not happen. Now, there were some positive things that came out of the NATO conference. Sweden joining NATO, Turkey kind of turning around, stabbing Russia in the back to make that happen. You would think there was a lot of positive PR, but instead, a lot of what people remembered this 10 days ago was Zelensky clearly very frustrated, angry, saying, this is absurd. And on the Russian side, the bloggers making, a big deal out of this, saying, look, this is a huge catastrophe for Zelensky, for the war effort. Well, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that there was clearly the frustration. And yes, it does look like maybe this was a gamble that Zelensky was wanting to show, despite the fact that this was going to be very tough going, with no air support or no air dominance, that maybe small gains and showing that NATO and the allies that something is happening would be enough to get NATO to commit. NATO gives a timeline. This is a huge win and very difficult for the Russian propaganda machine. This did not happen. So this is, difficult for Zelensky and for the Ukrainian side of the propaganda machine, which admittedly does exist. But take one more step further. Does this mean that we should be criticizing Zelensky? Well, the issue is here. If you take a look at the entire Ukrainian war in Crimea and what has been happening there, and forgive me if you ever hear me say Crimea, I say Crimea, it's hard for me not to say Crimea instead of Crimea, because you hear it in Ukrainian, Krim, you hear it in Russian, you hear it's Krim, but anyway, Crimea. When you talk about the whole invasion in Crimea and what's happened there and the landmines, there's another question there, and that is water. Okay, water. And you say, well, water. Yeah, Crimea doesn't have water. You say, well, yeah, because the Kakhovka Dam. No, you got to go back further. 2014, when we had the rebellion in Donetsk and Ukraine cut off the water or lowered the amount of water that goes through the Crimean Canal that basically distributes water to like 85% of Crimea. No, we have to go back still further. Actually, and I'm going to put a link in here to an article on this that came out really just before the war even started, that talked about the long-term future of Crimea and points out that going back to 1917, there were going to be problems with water in Crimea. This was recognized. And like I said, I'm going to put an article on this. It's quite interesting, goes through the entire thing. But what we have to understand here is that these battles, or this war, is actually maybe the first real war, certainly the first large-scale war over water rights. That is one of the key issues here. And actually, before the war started, when we would hear some people, even some of our clients, would say, well, we don't really think the Russians will invade, they're just bluffing. Well, first of all, the Russians don't really bluff. Once they spend the money, they tend to go forward. So when you have that buildup, we were saying, look, the buildup's there. Our people are saying it's coming, but there's also this water issue, which it seems like people didn't seem to take seriously. This water issue for Crimea, I did it again, for Crimea is important. But then there's the greater issue there. What is the point from the Russian side? You are now fighting over a portion of Ukraine, and you can say historically, if you want to argue that belongs to you, etc. But we have now a portion of Ukraine that is heavily mined, that does not have enough water, and everyone has hit a stalemate. No one's going anywhere. I mean, this does not make sense. This doesn't make sense. We can look at Zelensky and say he's gambling, say he's pushing, saying that Ukraine is going to have a very difficult time getting a breakthrough. Maybe it still will. Maybe it still will. But yes, when we take a look at what's going on here and the Russian strategy and even this Russian kind of overconfidence in these games, whether we're talking about what's happening with the buildup in Kupiansk or we're talking about Belarus, we do have to question the logic of the entire scenario. But now let's go on to the third thing. Thing 3, the Balkans, Kosovo and Serbia. Now, isn't it funny how when you talk about Kosovo, Serbia, or just, the history, world history, we were just talking about World War I in Thing 1 and Thing 2, that it all comes back around. I mean, World War I, the assassination of Ferdinand. Then you could argue that where we are today is all an extension of everything happened from World War I till now. I'm not blaming the Serbs for everything. I'm just saying you can make that argument. But let's talk about today. Let's talk about Serbia and Kosovo. Now, some of you will know this history a bit, so I'm just going to blast through it. If you need more, I mean, there's plenty out there. You can hit Wikipedia and war in Kosovo, war in Yugoslavia. But basically what happened, you had the war in Yugoslavia. This was followed by the war in Kosovo, the result of which meant that you have a separatist state, Kosovo, that's not recognized by the United Nations, although there's pressure on the Serbs to help make this happen, this normalization process. And you have Serbia and Kosovo next to each other. They can't get along, and there are Serb enclaves in North Kosovo where the Serbs now, years after the war, many years after the war, 20 years after the war, you have a situation where Serbs are saying they've been harassed, that the Kosovo police presence sometimes becomes violent, that their rights are ignored, et cetera, et cetera. Now, from the Kosovo side, they desperately want, sometimes beyond desperately, sometimes almost militantly, want Kosovo to be recognized as an independent state by the UN, by the rest of not every country in the EU. For example, Spain does not recognize Kosovo as an independent state. And this is where, the rubber hits the road. Now, Serbia, obviously under the leadership of President Alexander Vučić, Alexander Vučić, he very often, when he speaks to the home crowd, and he's got some kind of nationalistic type supporters among, not all of them, but among his supporters, he can be very Serbian and say, no, this is, Kosovo is part of our history. We will never give up Kosovo, etc. When he speaks to the EU, he's a little bit more, yes, we do want to join the EU. Yes, we can keep talking. Not that he's saying we're going to give up Kosovo, but yes, so you see how it's going. To be honest, he's between a rock and a hard place because Serbia has traditionally had very strong ties to Russia. They've been energy dependent on Russia, like other countries I can think of. in the EU. But then you have Kosovo. And from the Kosovo side, which Kosovo is mostly ethnic Albanian now, you've got Albin Kurti, the prime minister, who is under a ton of pressure from his own constituency, which is also very much, we need to be independent and to hell with the Serbs, etc. So they have a hard time getting along. You go back just to last year, things came to a head over license plates. License plates? Yes, license plates, because Kosovo wanted ethnic Serbs in Kosovo to change their license plates from Serb license plates to Kosovo license plates. This was immediately construed as de facto recognition of Kosovo as an independent state. Serbs flipped out. They said, we're not going to do this. There have been protests, lots of bumping heads. Then there were arrests on both sides, and things got worse and worse. And what we started to see was an escalation, and then the US and the EU would step in and push it down. Then an escalation, and they would step in and they'd push it down. But unfortunately, kind of always going up until finally the US and the EU kind of pretty much called both leaders on the carpet more than once and got them to commit more towards, at least supposedly, towards normalization, de-escalation, etc., which has gone almost to the point of conflict, in the sense that what would happen is there would be very vehement protests by ethnic Serbs, which were made worse by some kind of sort of semi-sham elections that the Kosovo government pushed through. And then Vučić would do the Vučić thing, which say, we're going to put all of our troops on the border on a heightened state of alert, as if, we might invade again, intervene, take care of our Serbs in Kosovo. Then you would have Albin Kurti throw a fit, point out to the EU, look how these Serbs are acting, but at the same time, Vučić would point out how the Albanians were acting, and it did tend to kind of look as if the US was finally getting a little bit sick of the way Kurti was asking, and even the EU was getting frustrated, and again, called both these guys on the carpet, and we're back to where we were. Except we're kind of not. Because one thing that has sort of happened that maybe people have not noticed is a certain statement that Vučić has made. Two statements, actually. One is he made a request this week. He actually called out to NATO and to KFOR and made it, very vocal to the EU and said, we need KFOR to do their job and protect our people in Kosovo. Now, in the past, you would see Vučić come out and say, we're going to stack our military on the border and we might just need to go intervene. A lot of this was probably bluff. And you could say, well, he doesn't want to do this now because he's got some problems at home. There's, half of the people in Serbia are protesting against him. Okay. That's not my point. My point is this. There's a second statement that he made. He made this a few weeks ago and he reiterated it again only a couple of days ago. He said, you don't think we see how Kosovo is arming up? A few weeks ago, he said, we're concerned because we're seeing that they have very advanced weapons. They have better weapons than we have. So he did one other thing, which probably flew under the radar of a lot of people. He basically said there's now going to be a moratorium on Serb arms sales abroad because we need to worry about our own security. What does this mean? Hey, well, it's pretty clear. He said it. It means they're stocking up. Now, what I'm not saying, I'm definitely not ready to say this, is to say that in 30 days, we're going to have a new conflict, a war in the Balkans. I am saying, because he's saying that they're stocking up, Now, this is not, I don't think this has been missed by the US or the EU. They're keeping an eye on it. There's more talks, et cetera, but it's summer, it's getting hot. Years and years in Central Europe, even back in the early 90s, when it got hot, tempers flared, more protests, things got out of hand. And this, for me, is the third thing. Keep an eye on this thing. Let's pray that we do not see renewed conflict in the Balkans, because it seems like we've been on the edge forever. Now, that's all. That's all for the three things from the corners. Again, check out the website, www.Thecorners.pl. We put up new material every day. We're real into freedom of the press rights. I'm going to, we'll keep putting up articles on press rights, but there's a lot of other things we're going to throw up there too. And if you want more details, for example, like I said, once a week, we'll put up more details about the war in Ukraine. We put up summaries of some of the kind of the spy, the crime events, the kind of the appalling political events in the region once a week. Some of this is for Patreon users, some of it not, but it would be great if you guys could support us through Patreon, because this is a lot of work and nothing is for free. Otherwise, over and out. This is Preston Smith with The Corners. See ya, goodbye, adios, and do widzenia.